I returned from a month-long business trip, fully believing that my marriage was rock solid, that my husband was an honest man, and that the hospital my father spent his life building was in good hands. In less than an hour, I discovered that all of it was a carefully orchestrated lie designed to keep me far away while he destroyed everything we owned, and that he'd even had the audacity to install his mistress on my own executive floor. What happened in that lobby is something none of us will ever forget. But before I go on, make sure you check if you're already subscribed to the channel and let me know in the comments where you're watching this video from. We love seeing how far our stories travel. My plane landed at O'Hare at 11 a.m., and my hair still smelled like hotel shampoo. 30 hours earlier, I had been in Berlin, closing the final contract of a negotiation that spanned 4 weeks, 3 countries. And more meetings than I can count. We secured state-of-the-art surgical equipment and advanced imaging systems that my father had dreamed of installing in our hospital since I was still wearing a middle school uniform. He didn't live to see it, but I was there with my name, my voice, and my stubborn, imperfect German, making it a reality for him. My name is Victoria Sterling. I am 30 years old. The chairwoman of the board of Sterling Healthcare Group, the largest private hospital network in the state, and the daughter of a man who spent his entire life building something much bigger than himself. He died believing I could handle whatever he left behind. And I do. I always have. It's just that no one ever sees the price of it. When my father passed away 3 years ago, I was 27 and married to a charismatic man named Julian, whom everyone adored. Julian knew how to walk into a room and make everyone feel important. He knew exactly whose hand to shake, when to smile, and how to give the perfect press interview. What he didn't know, or didn't care to know, was how to read a financial balance sheet, navigate a highly technical medical negotiation, or make a tough call without asking me first. So that's how we operated. I ran the show from behind the scenes, and he took the spotlight. It wasn't what I originally wanted, but it worked. And for a while, I convinced myself that this was what love meant, shrinking your own space so your partner could shine. When my chauffeur picked me up at the airport, I didn't ask to go home. I told him to head straight to the hospital in downtown Chicago. I wanted to see Julian. I wanted to present the trip's results to the board of directors that very afternoon, walk through every department and see with my own eyes that everything was running smoothly. 4 weeks was far too long to rely on filtered corporate reports. Sterling Medical Center is located right near the Magnificent Mile, a towering structure of glass and steel my dad inaugurated when I was 12. I remember holding his hand at the ribbon-cutting ceremony, staring up at the facade as if it were a cathedral. I grew up inside those walls. I know the name of every security guard, every veteran triage nurse, and exactly how every hallway smells depending on which wing you're in. I asked the driver to drop me off at the main public entrance, not the underground executive garage. I wanted to walk in like anybody else. I wanted to see what the hospital looked like when no one knew the chairwoman was walking through. The main lobby was operating at its usual rhythm. Hectic, loud, full of families waiting for news with that specific look of people collectively holding their breath. I stood near the central pillar for a moment, just observing. There was something comforting in that organized chaos. It was life unfolding in real time. That was when I heard the loud, irritated voice laced with that specific tone of someone who mistakenly believes that volume equals being right. A young woman no older than 23 was standing near the reception desk with her phone held out in front of her live streaming. She was wearing a skin-tight designer romper that was completely wildly inappropriate for a hospital environment. And she was screaming at Frank, a security guard who had been working there since my father was alive. Frank is an older man with white hair, shoulders slightly hunched from age, and a very gentle way of speaking. She was pointing her finger at his chest like he'd committed a felony. The issue, from what I could gather, was that Frank had moved a luggage cart she had piled high with luxury shopping bags, which she had carelessly abandoned right in the middle of the main entrance as if it were her own living room. Frank was apologizing. She wasn't having it. She kept yelling, pivoting her phone's camera to capture the reactions of the people around her for her followers. I watched for about 30 seconds, then walked over. I didn't shout. There was no need. I pitched my voice into the tone I learned from my father. Low, firm, unwavering. I told her that this was an environment meant for healing and recovery, that Frank deserved respect, and that live streaming in the middle of the main lobby violated 3 separate patient privacy policies clearly listed on the placard right. Behind her, she looked me up and down with the face of someone calculating if the fight was worth it. She decided it was. She flipped her camera lens toward me and started telling her viewers that some arrogant, bitter woman was trying to intimidate her, that I was probably some frustrated, underpaid employee, definitely divorced and undeniably jealous. I didn't take the bait, but when she took an aggressive step toward me, her elbow purposely clipped my arm. My large iced coffee, which I had bought downstairs and hadn't even taken a sip of, yet flew out of my hand and spilled all over my pristine white tailored blazer. It was the blazer my dad had bought me in New York for my 28th birthday just 2 months before he died. She looked at the massive brown stain, then looked back at me and smiled. It was the most calculated, malicious smile I've ever seen on a 20-something's face. Then she leaned in and whispered, just low enough, so only I could hear. You better watch who you're messing with. My husband is the CEO of this hospital, and he can end your pathetic career right here with one phone call. I froze. Not out of fear, but out of sheer horrifying recognition. Her husband was the CEO of the hospital. The CEO of the hospital was Julian, my husband. There is a specific kind of pain that doesn't strike you like a bolt of lightning. It creeps up slowly like freezing water rising around your body. First you feel it in your feet, then your legs, and by the time you realize what's happening, you're completely submerged and can't tell where the shock ends and the despair begins. That is exactly how I felt standing in that lobby wearing a coffee-stained blazer, with her smug smile hanging in the air between us. But I didn't collapse. I learned very early on that leaders do not break down in front of an audience. I learned it watching my dad hold back tears in the ICU while signing crisis management forms with his other hand. I learned it when I took over the board at 27 and had to look men twice my age in the eye and convince them I knew exactly what I was doing. So I took a deep breath and kept my face entirely neutral. She had no idea who I was. That much was obvious. To her, I was a nobody. Maybe an exhausted resident who got annoyed by the noise. The idea that the woman standing in front of her, dripping in iced coffee, was the person whose surname was engraved in bronze above the building's entrance hadn't even crossed her mind. For a brief second, I thought about using that to my advantage. I thought about walking away, heading up to my office, having my assistant pull every single piece of footage and data from the last 4 weeks, and acting with the absolute coldness of someone who has all the facts and the time to plot. But then, my phone vibrated. It was a text from Dr. Thomas Harrison, the chief of cardiology and one of the most brilliant, respected physicians in the network. More importantly, he was one of the very few people I trusted implicitly since the days I was just the founder's daughter. His text was blunt. You're here. We need to talk. Urgent. Not about the hospital. Thomas knew I was back. And the urgency coming from a man who rarely used that word told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't about the German medical equipment. I texted back asking him to come down to the main lobby discreetly. While I waited, I observed her from a distance. She had gone back to her live stream, eagerly reconstructing her narrative of what just happened, painting herself as the brave victim and me as the unhinged villain. Frank had stepped away with the quiet dignity of a man who had seen enough of the world to know when to stop throwing fuel on the fire. I walked over to him before Thomas arrived, gently touched his arm and told him quietly that he didn't owe anyone an apology. The mistake wasn't his, and I was going to handle it. He looked into my eyes, instantly recognized me, and for a second I thought he was going to address me by my title. Instead, he just gave a very slight nod. His expression said, I trust you, without him having to utter a single word. Thomas appeared from a side corridor, walking with the brisk, purposeful stride of someone trying not to draw attention. He was tall, wearing a crisp white lab coat with touches of silver at his temples, and that reserved way of projecting total authority without a hint of arrogance. He was 15 years older than me and had been my anchor through the worst professional storms of my life. When he saw my face, his expression conveyed more than any text message ever could. We stepped into a quiet corner of the lobby, shielded from the main foot traffic. He spoke in a low, rapid, no-nonsense voice. Over the last 4 weeks while I was in Europe, Julian had signed a series of massive vendor contracts bypassing the board of directors entirely. We were talking about astronomical sums going to shell companies no one in our purchasing department had ever heard of. These were approvals that strictly required my signature, but Julian had managed to push them through using a bureaucratic loophole he had either found or created. Thomas had stumbled upon it completely by accident while reviewing an inventory report that didn't add up. He started pulling the thread, and what he found on the other end was enough to put someone in federal prison. But there was something else. The intern. The girl in the designer romper currently standing near the entrance, holding her phone, who had just spilled coffee on me. She wasn't a standard intern. Julian had personally mandated her hiring as a direct favor to HR. No interview process, no background check. She had a platinum keycard granting her full access to the executive suites. Security logs showed she had been seen leaving Julian's private office well after business hours multiple times. I listened to all of this without blinking. When Thomas finished, he stood in silence, watching me carefully. like a surgeon who just delivered a devastating diagnosis and is waiting to see the patient's reaction. I only said one thing. I needed the complete file. Everything he had found organized by dates and wire transfer amounts, and I needed it in an hour. He nodded. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and dialed Mr. Mitchell, the corporate counsel who had handled our legal affairs for over a decade. He was the most ruthlessly discreet man I knew. As the line rang, I glanced out of the corner of my eye at the girl still live streaming across the room, blissfully unaware that the ground was about to open up and swallow her and Julian right along with her. Mr. Mitchell picked up. I need you at the hospital right now, I told him. Bring the immediate executive termination paperwork and the documents to file with federal prosecutors for gross misconduct and wire fraud. I'll explain when you get here. I hung up, adjusted my stained blazer, and waited. Julian stepped out of the executive elevator into the lobby 13 minutes later. I knew he'd be down quickly, not because he felt guilty, but because this was his modus operandi. Whenever Julian felt the ground shifting, his primary strategy was to show up before the damage was visible, flash his million-dollar smile, and convince everyone that everything was perfectly under control. It used to be the talent I admired most in him. Now, it was the weapon I was waiting to see deployed against me. His custom suit was immaculate, but his tie was slightly askew, a dead giveaway that he had rushed. He scanned the lobby and locked eyes with me before he even spotted her. For a fraction of a second, I watched his brain process the math. He didn't know exactly what I knew, but he knew I was standing there. He knew Dr. Harrison was by my side, and he knew his mistress was standing 20 feet away, holding a phone to her face. 3 variables that formed an equation he needed to solve before anyone else checked the math. He turned over to me beaming. He said he was so happy to see me that the trip had been too long and that I should have told him I was landing so he could have picked me up personally. I simply replied that I preferred walking in unannounced, to see how things were actually running. His expression shifted. Only someone who has stared at a face for years can catch that micro-expression. The tightening of the jaw, a slight panic behind the eyes, the frantic calculation happening right behind the smile. And then she noticed him. She marched across the lobby toward him, likely having spotted him on her phone screen. She walked with the confident, entitled strut of someone who fully expects to be welcomed. The exact moment she placed her hand intimately on his forearm and he didn't immediately shove it off confirmed everything. Any microscopic shred of doubt vanished. Her live stream was still running. Thousands of strangers were watching in real time. I was standing there in a ruined suit. Thomas was 2 steps behind me and my phone buzzed with a text from Mr. Mitchell saying he was in the elevator. I could have lost my mind right there. It would have been human justified and entirely understandable. But that wasn't what my father would have done. My dad always told me that the difference between a reaction and a decision is the amount of time you can sit in total silence before you open your mouth. He taught me that silence, when weaponized correctly, is louder than any scream. So I stayed dead silent for a long moment. Then I turned my body away from Julian, facing the entire lobby, the waiting families, the nurses, the security guards, and the lens of her smartphone. And I introduced myself. I stated my name, my title, and exactly who I was in relation to that building. The physical reaction was instantaneous. The girl turned into a statue. Julian's face drained of all color. The comments on her live stream became a blurry waterfall of text. Then, using the calmest, coldest voice I could summon from the depths of my lungs, I began to speak. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I didn't make hysterical accusations. I just methodically narrated the chronological timeline of everything uncovered in the last few hours. The unauthorized vendor contracts, the embezzled corporate funds, her highly irregular hiring process, and the unauthorized after hours. Access to the executive suites. Mr. Mitchell arrived halfway through my monologue and stood silently beside me holding a thick leather briefcase. His sheer presence communicated exactly how legally catastrophic this was about to be. Julian tried to interrupt. He tried to explain. He tried to deploy his signature charm to make everyone feel like this was just one big, silly misunderstanding. But this time, there was a camera. There were dozens of witnesses, and there was a briefcase full of hard evidence. The young woman, realizing her entire reality was disintegrating on the internet, desperately tried to pivot. She looked into her phone and started whining to her followers that she was being bullied, that she didn't know anything, and that she was the innocent victim of a crazy, jealous wife's conspiracy. That was when Dr. Harrison stepped forward. He didn't even raise his voice. With the quiet, absolute authority of a man who had spent decades keeping people alive in that very building, he looked at her and said, "There is a paper trail proving you personally signed wire transfers tied to those shell accounts. That puts you squarely in the crosshairs of the federal prosecutors for wire fraud, regardless of what you claim to know. Her hand started shaking so badly she almost dropped the phone. The smug smile was completely gone, and for the first time since I walked through those sliding doors, she shut her mouth. The thing about the absolute truth is that the silence that follows it never lasts long. Julian was officially terminated from his position as CEO that very afternoon by an emergency vote of the board of directors. I chaired the meeting, slid the folders across the mahogany table, and the board voted unanimously, without a hint of resistance. Most of them had suspected something was off. They just hadn't had the courage or the smoking gun to do anything about it. Julian was escorted out of the building by security. He couldn't even look me in the eye. What surprised me wasn't the pain. I fully expected the heartbreak. What shocked me was the bizarre, floaty sense of lightness that followed. It felt exactly like carrying a 100-pound backpack for years, forgetting it was even there, and then suddenly someone unbuckles it. You feel the weight of your own body in a completely new way. I went home to an empty house that night and sat in my dark kitchen for a long time, without turning on the lights. I thought about my dad. I thought about how he would have been the first person to tell me I executed everything perfectly, but also the first to tell me that I needed to cry before I could move forward. He always said true leaders need the cover of night, that strength isn't the absence of pain, it's the ability to feel the pain and refuse to let it make your decisions for you. So I cried. I sobbed until the sun started to come up. But I didn't cry over Julian. I cried for the time I'd lost. I cried for the years I spent shrinking my own potential just to prop up his ego, believing that protecting his fragile pride was the same as protecting us. I mourned the version of myself who honestly believed that love meant playing the background music so someone else could be the main character. My PR director woke me up with 19 unread texts. The girl's live stream had completely escaped her control and taken over the internet, just not the way she had intended. The clip that went viral wasn't the one of my coffee-stained jacket. It was the moment I stood there, unbothered and composed, while she bragged that her husband could destroy anyone in the building. The internet possesses a very special, ruthless instinct for irony. Alongside the viral video came a flood of comments from current and former hospital employees, doctors, nurses, admin staff, sharing their own stories about Julian. Stories of nepotism, arbitrary firings, and using his position for his own vanity. I hadn't known about any of these incidents. Or, more accurately, I had chosen not to see them because seeing them would have required dismantling the illusion I had worked so hard to build. That was the hardest pill to swallow, the realization that I had been passively complicit, not out of malice, but out of a blind, boundaryless love. I called a press conference for 3 o'clock that afternoon, not to defend my personal life and not to publicly bash my soon-to-be ex-husband, but because the hospital was far bigger than my personal scandal. The institution, the patients, and the staff deserved a clear, responsible official voice, not an information vacuum that breeds rumors. Thomas walked into the auditorium with me. We had set up a 100-seat room with 6 different media cameras. I wore a tailored navy blue suit that my dad had helped me pick out during a trip to New York just before he got sick. It wasn't a conscious, sentimental choice when I pulled it from the closet, but when I looked in the mirror, I decided to keep it on. I sat at the center of the table, flanked by Dr. Harrison on my right and Mr. Mitchell on my left. I started by talking about the hospital. I talked about our patient care metrics, our community outreach, and the state-of-the-art surgical tech I had just spent a month securing in Germany. I needed the public to understand, above all else, that Sterling Healthcare Group was standing strong and wasn't going anywhere. Then I addressed Julian's termination. I gave no dramatic flair, no emotional details, just the facts, the timeline, and the consequences. I confirmed an internal forensic audit was underway and that federal authorities had been fully briefed. Then a reporter directed a question at Dr. Harrison. It was the question I had been dreading. Social media had taken his presence beside me in the lobby, the protective way he stepped in front of me, and the way we looked at each other, and spun it into a massive parallel narrative. The internet had edited the footage into a romantic, dramatic storyline that was highly convenient but entirely speculative. Before I could run interference, Thomas pulled the microphone toward himself and told the absolute truth. He stated that he had worked under my father for a dozen years, that he had watched me grow up inside those hospital walls, and that he had spent the last 4 weeks secretly building a federal case file to honor a promise he made to a man he deeply respected, to protect the hospital and the people who relied on it. He looked directly into the cameras and said that what he felt for me was profound admiration and respect, and that both were entirely legitimate. Then the room went dead silent, as he added that he wasn't going to hide the fact that he admired me as a woman, not just as an executive. But he said, his voice steady, "I have never once allowed that to cross a professional line. Because I am not the kind of man who confuses admiration with opportunism." It was the most brutally honest thing I had ever heard a man say on live television. And it was exactly in that moment, with a terrifying clarity, that I realized I had been admiring him too for a lot longer than I wanted to admit. But that wasn't the time for it. I wrapped up the press conference by thanking the staff and announcing that Dr. Thomas Harrison would immediately step in as interim chief medical officer with expanded executive oversight while we restructured the administration. The applause in the room wasn't polite. It was the sound of collective relief. The divorce took 6 agonizing months. Julian hired 3 different high-priced lawyers cycling through strategies. First, he denied the embezzlement. Then he minimized it. Then he tried to throw his subordinates under the bus. Finally, he claimed I had known about the offshore accounts all along and was implicitly involved. Every strategy fell apart faster than the last because Thomas and the compliance team had built a paper trail that was absolutely bulletproof. The influencer tried to cut a plea deal. She cried to the authorities, claiming she was a naive victim, that Julian manipulated her, and that she had no idea the luxury downtown condo he paid for was funded by stolen hospital money. Parts of that were probably true. She was young, and she let herself be blinded by a lifestyle she felt she was owed. But the truth and the consequences are 2 different things, and the consequences arrived regardless. Her condo was seized by the feds, and her bank accounts were frozen. The forensic investigation eventually proved that Julian had set up his little embezzlement ring nearly 2 years prior. It started right after my father's death, capitalizing on the exact moment I was drowning in grief. That was the most sickening part. Not the cheating, not the stolen money. It was the timing. The fact that the moment I was most shattered, most vulnerable, and most desperate to cling to the illusion of a stable marriage was the exact moment he started robbing me blind. I walked into the final divorce hearing with an ironclad case and walked out with almost everything. In practice, Julian had built his entire wealth using the leverage of my family's company. Without the sterling name, the CEO title, and the hospital's credit line, he had nothing. When the judge stamped the final decree, Julian sat across the table looking completely hollowed out. It wasn't anger or remorse. It was the look of a man who had finally stopped running and realized he was entirely alone in the dark. I signed the papers without a word, walked out of the downtown courthouse, and stood on the Chicago pavement. The sun hit my face. It was just a regular Wednesday afternoon. Yellow cabs were honking. A guy was selling hot dogs on the corner. A woman was walking a golden retriever while talking on her AirPods. The world kept spinning as if my entire life hadn't just been detonated and rebuilt, and in a way that was incredibly comforting. I called my mom, then I called my assistant to say I'd be in the office at 8 a.m., and then I walked aimlessly for 40 minutes, something I rarely do but something my dad always insisted cleared the mind. As usual, he was right. 2 years after that explosive morning in the lobby, Sterling Medical Center is a different place. Not on the outside. The glass facade is the same, the logo hasn't changed, and the hallways still smell like that sharp, clean antiseptic. But it's different inside. You can feel it in the way the staff walks without fear, with clarity about what they are doing and why. Thomas revolutionized the chief medical officer role into a model of transparency that other national hospital groups are now studying. It wasn't theoretically groundbreaking. It was just consistently ethical. Open-door meetings, transparent financial indicators, shared decision-making, and zero tolerance for the kind of toxic nepotism Julian had normalized. I am still the chairwoman, but I lead differently now. I am fiercely present. I no longer subscribe to the absurd notion that I have to make myself small so a man can feel tall. I learned the hard way that clearing a path for someone else shouldn't mean erasing your own footprints. As for the girl in the romper, she vanished from social media a few months after the scandal peaked. Someone in HR mentioned she moved back to her small Midwestern hometown. I felt absolutely zero satisfaction hearing that. I just felt that heavy. Hollow empathy you get when a story that could have been beautiful ends in a train wreck, not because the universe is cruel, but because actions have weight. And sometimes people pick up more weight than their spine can handle. Julian took a plea deal with the district attorney to avoid federal prison time. I heard through the grapevine that he's living a quiet life in another state, trying to rebuild in whatever way he can. I didn't follow up on the details. There was no reason to look backward. On a crisp September evening, Thomas asked me out to dinner. It wasn't a shock. There had been a quiet, steady electric tension between us for 2 years. A tension we both consciously and respectfully ignored while the dust settled. But 2 years had passed. I had gone to therapy. I had cried the tears I needed to cry. I had finally learned how to sleep through the night without the suffocating paranoia that someone was dismantling my life behind my back. He chose a quiet, dimly lit, incredible Italian place right on the Chicago Riverwalk. Halfway through our meal, he looked at me and spoke with that same direct honesty I had always loved. He said he waited because he knew I needed to heal. He waited because he wanted to be absolutely certain that what he felt wasn't just trauma bonding from a corporate crisis, but something real that existed before the storm and survived the aftermath. And it had. I didn't answer him immediately. I sat there, looking across the table at the man who had secretly built a federal case while I was in Germany out of loyalty to my late father. The man who stood firmly beside me in a lobby full of hostile cameras asking for nothing. The man who knew my first name long before he cared about my executive title and who respected both equally. And then I smiled and said yes. I didn't say it with the naive lightness of a girl who had never been broken. I said it with the grounded solidity of a woman who had been shattered, swept up her own pieces, figured out how they fit back together, and was choosing with her eyes wide open to step forward. My dad used to say that the hospital he built was above all things a place of recovery. He believed the greatest miracle of medicine wasn't just pulling someone back from the brink of death. It was helping them learn how to actually live again after the crisis passed. It took me 2 years to realize that quote was meant for me too. But I finally get it. And today when I walk through those sliding glass doors first thing in the morning with the sun bouncing off the Chicago skyline and the lobby just waking up, I don't walk in carrying the weight of having to prove my worth. I walk in as someone who completely belongs there. And I found that makes all the difference in the world. Now, if you liked this story, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments which part left your jaw on the floor. Oh, and don't forget to become a channel member for access to exclusive videos I don't post anywhere else.